The contract was for 30 nights. That was the first thing I noticed. Not 30 days, 30 nights. The distinction was written into the agreement 3 separate times, bolded twice, and initialed by a representative of Hargrove County, whose signature I couldn't read. I should have paid more attention to that. I should have paid attention to a lot of things. My name's Marcus Hale. I'm 41 years old, and I've been doing private security work for 11 years, mostly in East Texas. Warehouse lots, foreclosed commercial properties, the occasional ranch estate going through probate. Unglamorous work. The kind of thing you do when you got a security license, a reliable truck, and no particular ambition beyond making the next month's bills. I'm not complaining. I chose it. After 14 years in the Army and 2 deployments that left me with a knee that predicts rain and a therapist I stopped seeing in 2019, sitting alone in the dark watching nothing felt like a reasonable way to spend a career. The job for Piney Creek Wildlife Park came through a firm I'd subcontracted with before, Allied Protective Services out of Longview. My handler there was a woman named Dana Weiss. She called me on a Tuesday in late October and described the assignment in a voice that was just a little too rehearsed, like she was reading from something. Defunct municipal zoo, 18 acres, fenced perimeter, single access road. The county had seized the property after the previous operator defaulted on a land use agreement, and now a development group out of Dallas was in the process of purchasing it for commercial redevelopment. Standard 30-day security hold before the title transfer finalized. All I had to do was be on site from sundown to sunup, make regular perimeter checks, log anything unusual, and make sure nobody wandered in to strip copper or spray paint the walls. It's easy money, Dana told me. Probably the easiest job I've sent your way. I asked her why the pay was almost double my usual rate. There was a pause that lasted 1 beat too long. Remote location. The county wanted someone experienced. I didn't push it. Double rate for sitting in a truck on a dead property in the woods sounded fine to me. I drove out the following Friday to do my walkthrough. Piney Creek Wildlife Park sat about 12 miles south of a town called Harlow. Population 400 and shrinking. The access road was a single lane of crumbling asphalt that threaded through the dense loblolly pine for almost 2 miles, before ending at a rusted chain link gate topped with razor wire. Beyond the gate, a gravel lot opened up in front of what had once been the main visitor center. A long, flat-roofed building with faded murals of smiling animals painted across its face. A cartoon elephant, a grinning lion. The paint had blistered and peeled so that the animals looked like they were melting almost. Past the visitor center, the park fanned out along a series of concrete paths that connected enclosures, service buildings, and with a site map called habitat zones. Most of the enclosures were open-air pens ringed by concrete walls and heavy-gauge fencing. A few of the larger ones, the big cat habitats, the bear enclosure, were built into natural depressions in the terrain and reinforced with steel barriers that had gone brown with rust. Vegetation had taken over nearly everything. Vines crawled up the fencing. Weeds cracked through the wallways. In some areas, young pine trees had pushed through the concrete itself, splitting it apart in slow motion. The whole place had been closed for 9 years. I walked the perimeter that first afternoon with a clipboard and a site map that the county provided. The fencing was intact on 3 sides. The 4th side, the eastern boundary, backed up against a wooded ravine, and the fence there had buckled in 2 places. Storm damage, probably. Or maybe just age. I noted it and photographed it. I made a mental note to keep my truck parked where I could see the main gate and the eastern tree line at the same time. What I didn't note, not that first day, was the smell. It was faint, a sourness underneath the expected scent of mildew and wet concrete. The kind of smell you'd associate with a deer carcass in the brush, except thinner, older, like it had been baked into the ground over years and was now just part of the air. I noticed it near the bear enclosure, and again near a service tunnel that ran beneath the main path. Both times, I paused, registered it, and moved on. I set up my base of operations in the parking lot. I had my truck, a camp chair, a thermos, a handheld spotlight, and a logbook. The county had given me a two-way radio tuned to the sheriff's dispatch frequency, though I was told not to expect much in the way of response time. Harlow had only 2 deputies, and they covered 300 square miles between them. I also had a Mossberg 500 and a rack behind the seat, standard kit for rural work. I'd never fired it on the job. Night 1, there was nothing. Night 2, still nothing. The woods made noise. They always do. Owls, coyotes yipping somewhere south, the occasional crack of a branch that could have been a deer or a falling limb, or just the forest settling into the cold. I did my walks every 90 minutes, flashlight in one hand, radio in the other, following the same loop around the perimeter path. Everything was still. Everything was empty. On night 3, I found the bones. They were in the old aviary, a long, cage-roofed structure near the center of the park that had once housed birds. The wire mesh overhead had collapsed in several places, and the interior was choked with dead leaves and fallen branches. I'd walked past it twice on previous nights without going in. This time, my flashlight caught something pale on the ground near the back wall, and I went to look. It was a deer's rib cage. At least, I think it was. Picked completely clean. The bones were scattered in a loose pile along what looked like a pelvis and part of a spine. No skull. I crouched down and studied them. The marks on the ribs were wrong. I'd cleaned enough game in my life to know what tooth marks from coyotes or even feral dogs looked like, and these, they weren't that. The scoring was deep, gouged in parallel lines like something had scraped the meat off with thick, blunt claws. Some of the ribs were cracked, not bitten through. Cracked, the way you'd snap a stick over your knee. I logged it. Deer remains, aviary structure, probably predator activity. Recommend wildlife assessment. I didn't think much more about it. The next night, I found another pile. This one was near the old reptile house, partially stuffed into a drainage grate, like something had tried to push it underground. More deer, same clean bones, same deep scoring. And again, no skull. On night 5, I found a third. This time, it was larger. An elk, or maybe a large buck. It was laid out in the center of the bear enclosure, right in the middle of the concrete pit, almost as if arranged. That's the word that came to mind, and the word I didn't write down. The bones weren't scattered the way they would be if an animal had been feeding there over time. They were placed. The spine was intact, curving in a semicircle. The ribs fanned out symmetrically on either side. The leg bones were set parallel to one another at the base, like the foundation of some structure I couldn't identify. I stood at the railing of the bear enclosure and looked down at it for a long time. The concrete pit was 12 feet deep. The access ramp on the far side had been blocked with a welded steel gate years ago. Anything that had dragged a carcass down there had either jumped the railing and dropped 12 feet, or it had come from somewhere else that I couldn't see. I reported the bone sites to Dana the next morning. She thanked me, said she'd pass it along to the county, and asked if I felt safe continuing. I told her I did. She reminded me that the contract specified I shouldn't enter any enclosures, or go below ground level, just perimeter walks and visual checks. I hadn't noticed that clause before. I went back and read the contract again, and sure enough, there it was. Section 4, paragraph 2. Contractor shall limit patrol activity to open air paths and surface-level structures. Subsurface tunnels, maintenance corridors, and enclosed service areas are excluded from patrol scope. The language was specific, oddly specific. It read less like a liability clause and more like a warning. I followed the rule. For a while. The following week, the pattern started. Every night between 2 and 3 in the morning, something moved through the park. I never saw it directly, not at first, but I heard it. A heavy, rhythmic sound that traveled from the eastern tree line toward the center of the property. It wasn't footsteps exactly. It was more like something dragging weight across the ground, punctuated by pauses that lasted 10 to 15 seconds before the movement resumed. The sound had a route, It started at the eastern fence, passed through the gap in the vegetation near the old primate area, moved through the bear enclosure zone, and terminated somewhere near the service tunnel entrance on the far side of the park. The first time I heard it, I turned on my spotlight toward the sound and saw nothing. The beam cut through the dark, lit up rusted fencing and overgrown concrete, and revealed nothing alive. The second time, I was closer. I had been walking the perimeter path near the primate enclosures when the sound started, maybe 40 yards to my south. I stopped, switched off my flashlight, and listened. The dragging sound moved past me, left to right, at a walking pace. Something scraped against the chain-link fence on the far side of the path. I turned my light on. The fence was swaying. 3 of the vertical bars were bent outward, deformed by something that had pressed against them with enormous force. The metal was still warm. I started keeping a more detailed log after that. Times, directions, estimated distances. I brought a handheld voice recorder and captured the audio twice, though on playback it sounded nothing more than the wind settling debris. I told myself that was probably what it was. On night 9, I found tracks. They were deep. Whatever made them was heavy, 400 pounds at minimum. The shape was wrong for anything I could name. Too wide for a bear, too long for a big cat. 5 distinct toe impressions at the front of each print, splayed outward, each one ending in a deep puncture mark where something sharp had driven into the mud. The stride length was over 4 feet. The prints followed the fence line south for about 60 yards, then turned abruptly inward toward the park. At the point where they turned, there was a section of chain link that had been peeled back, like the lid of a sardine can. Not cut, not rusted through, peeled. The metal was bright and freshly exposed where it had been bent. I photographed everything. I went back to my truck and sat there until dawn with the Mossberg across my lap, and every light I had turned on. The next morning, I called Dana and told her I needed to talk to someone from the county, whoever had managed this property before me, whoever knew its history. She said she'd look into it and called back 2 hours later to tell me that the county's position was that the park had been closed due to funding issues and that no unusual wildlife activity had been documented on the property. "That's not what I asked," I said. "That's what they told me, Marcus." I drove into Harlow that afternoon. It was the kind of town that barely existed. A post office, a feed store, a gas station with a diner attached. I went to the diner. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, and when I told her I was working nights at the old zoo, something changed in her face. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. The look you give someone when they've confirmed something you already suspected. Her name was Darlene. She poured me a coffee and told me what she knew, which wasn't much, but was more than anyone else had offered. The zoo had operated for almost 20 years under a man named Gerald Pruitt. He had leased the land from the county and ran it as a private wildlife attraction. Small operation, mostly regional animals. Deer, black bears, birds of prey, a few exotic species he'd acquired through trades with other facilities. It had never been profitable, but Pruitt kept it going through donations and the occasional school field trip. The problem started about 8 years ago. Animals began dying, not from disease or neglect, but from predation. Something was getting into the enclosures at night and killing the stock. Pruitt found his birds torn apart first, then a pair of deer, then one of the bears. Each time, the carcasses were stripped down to bone. Each time, the remains were arranged in ways that didn't make sense for natural scavenging. "He set up cameras," Darlene told me. "Trail cams, the kind hunters use. He put up about a dozen of them." I asked what they showed. She looked at the counter. "He never said, but he stopped going out at night after that. Hired a boy to do the evening feedings. Paid him triple what the job was worth. That boy quit after a week. He wouldn't say why." Pruitt had tried to get help from the county. He'd contacted animal control, the game warden, even the parks department. Everyone had sent someone out during the daytime, found nothing unusual, and then filed reports that concluded the predation was likely due to coyotes or feral hogs. Pruitt had argued that no coyote could do what he'd seen. Nobody listened. Then, one of the bears disappeared. Not died, disappeared. An adult black bear, roughly 350 pounds, vanished from a reinforced closure with 12-foot walls and a steel gate. The gate was still locked. The walls were intact. The only sign of anything wrong was a series of deep grooves in the concrete at the bottom of the enclosure, running in parallel lines from the center toward the south wall. And a smell. A sweet, rotten-type smell that lingered in the pit for days. Pruitt closed the zoo 3 weeks later. He told people it was financial. He told the county it was financial. He signed the property back over and moved to Oklahoma. And as far as Darlene knew, he'd never come back and never talked about it again. "What do you think it was?" I asked. Darlene refilled my coffee and didn't answer for a while. When she did, her voice was flat and careful, like she was choosing each word. "Something moved into those woods a long time ago, before the zoo even. My grandmother used to say there were places in these pines where the animals went quiet. Not scared quiet, gone quiet. Like everything alive had just decided to be somewhere else." She paused. "Whatever Pruitt had in those cages, it was fed. Regular meals, every day, right there in the pens, where they couldn't run. I think something figured that out. And I think when the food stopped coming, it didn't leave. It just got hungrier." I drove back to the park that evening with a pit in my stomach that had nothing to do with the diner's coffee. That night, night 11, I heard it again. The dragging sound, the long pauses. But this time there was something else. A vocalization, low, resonant, coming from somewhere near the bear enclosure. Not a growl, not even a roar. It was a sound I'd never heard from any animal I could name. It rose and fell in a pattern that was almost rhythmic, almost deliberate, like breathing amplified through a chest cavity larger than anything that should exist in these woods. There was something underneath it, too. A clicking, rapid, irregular, like teeth or claws tapping against bone. I stayed in my truck. I turned on every light. The sound lasted for almost 40 minutes, then faded toward the eastern fence line and was gone. In the morning, I went to the bear enclosure. The bone arrangement from the previous week had been added to. New bones, fresh ones, still dark with moisture. They'd been woven into the existing structure. The pattern was more complex now. The rib arches had been extended upward, interlocked at their tips, the spine curved together, forming something almost circular. And in the center, placed with a precision that made my hands shake, was a skull. Not a deer skull, a bear skull. Old, yellowed, too large for the black bears that had been kept there. I took photographs. I sat in my truck and I looked at them on the camera's small screen, and I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Animals don't do this. Scavengers don't arrange bones into structures. Predators don't build. But something here did. I called Dana and told her I wanted to terminate the contract. She put me on hold for 11 minutes. When she came back, she told me that early termination would forfeit the entire payment. Not just the remaining nights, but the nights I'd already worked. I asked her if that was standard. She said it was in the contract. I went back and read it again. She was right. Section 7, paragraph 1. I'd signed it without reading closely enough because the money was so good. And now, I think I understand why the pay was so high. I stayed. Night 14 was when I broke the rule about enclosed structures. I'd been watching the service tunnel entrance for 3 nights. It was a concrete framed opening, built into a low hill near the center of the park, sealed with a heavy steel door that had been chained shut from the outside. The chain was new, much newer than anything else on the property, industrial grade, with a padlock that still had a manufacturer's sticker on it. Someone had come out here after the zoo closed and specifically secured this tunnel. The chain had been broken, not cut, broken. The links were stretched and deformed, pulled apart by something with the strength to treat hardened steel like taffy. The door behind it stood 6 inches ajar. The smell coming from inside was the same sourness I noticed on my first day, except concentrated, thick, alive. I had every reason not to go in. The contract told me not to. My instincts told me not to. The smell alone should have been enough. But I'd been sitting in the dark for 2 weeks, listening to something moving through this place every night, and not knowing had become worse than any answer I might find. I took the Mossberg. I took my flashlight. I took a deep breath that tasted like copper and rot. Then, I entered. The service tunnel was about 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, lined with concrete block, lit by nothing. The floor was smooth, slightly graded for drainage, and covered in a thin layer of sediment that recorded every footprint. There were no footprints except mine. Whatever used this tunnel didn't walk on the floor. I looked up and saw scrape marks on the ceiling. Deep, parallel grooves in the concrete, running the length of the tunnel in continuous lines. Something moved through here by gripping the ceiling and walls. The tunnel branched after about 50 yards. Left led toward the bear enclosure. Right led deeper into the hill, toward what the site map labeled as Maintenance Level 2, storage. The branch opened into a wide chamber beneath the bear enclosure, a service room with drain gates in the floor and rusted pipes along the walls. It had been used, I guessed, for waste management and cleaning when the enclosure was active. Now it was something else. The walls were covered. Bones, hundreds of them, pressed into the concrete like mosaic tiles, held in place by a dark resinous substance that had hardened to a shell. Skulls, deer, raccoon, possum, coyote, and others that I couldn't even identify. They were set into the upper portions of the walls in rows. Below them, long bones were arranged in radiating patterns that fanned out from a central point on the far wall. Rib bones formed arches, vertebrae traced spiraling lines. The whole room had been transformed into something deliberate and intricate, and completely, fundamentally, wrong. In the center of the floor, the drain grate had been pulled up and set aside. The pipe below it had been widened, clawed open, the concrete edges ragged and torn. It dropped straight down into the darkness. The smell was coming from there. I pointed my flashlight into the hole. The beam reached maybe 20 feet before the shaft curved, and I lost sight of the bottom. The walls of the shaft were scored with the same parallel grooves I'd seen on the tunnel ceiling, and there was something else. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the rough edges of the concrete. I pulled one free and held it in my flashlight beam. It was thick, almost bristled, darker than black bear fur, and much coarser. It was also warm. Not ambient warm. Body warm. I left. I walked back through the tunnel at a pace that was just barely controlled, and I sealed the door shut behind me with the length of a cable from my truck. It wouldn't hold against whatever had broken the chain, but it was all I had. That night, I sat in my truck and I thought about the contract. Not the money. The language. The clause about not entering enclosed structures. The clause about forfeiting pay if I left early. The clause specifying 30 nights, not 30 days. Someone had written those terms knowing exactly what was on this property. The security hold wasn't to protect the property from trespassers. It was to ensure someone was here, present, accounted for, on the grounds every night for 30 nights while the title transfer went through, so that whatever lived here stayed fed, stayed occupied, stayed in the park instead of ranging outward into the woods toward Harlow. I wasn't a security guard. I was fucking bait. The realization settled into me like cold water. I went back through everything. The double pay, Dana's rehearsed pitch, the county's refusal to discuss the property's history, the specificity of the contract. All of it pointed the same direction. The people who had arranged this job knew what was here. They'd known for years, and their solution wasn't to deal with it. Their solution was to make sure it had a reason to stay. Pruitt Zoo hadn't failed because of funding. It had been shut down because its real purpose? Keeping a population of captive animals on a fixed piece of land. Animals that couldn't flee. Animals that were easy to kill. It became untenable when the predation got too visible. The county had to let the lease lapse, chained up the tunnels, and moved on to the next strategy, which was apparently rotating warm bodies through the property on 30-day contracts and hoping for the best. I wondered how many contractors had done this job before me. I wondered if all of them had finished their 30 nights. On night 16, it came to the truck. I was sitting in the cab with the engine running and the headlights on, writing in my log, when the vehicle rocked. Not wind, not a bump, a deliberate lateral shove that tilted the truck on two wheels for a full second before it dropped back. I grabbed the Mossberg and hit the spotlight. The beam swept across the gravel lot and found nothing. Then I swung it left toward the visitor center, and for just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, I saw it. It was standing at the corner of the building, half behind the wall, watching me. The shape was wrong in ways I'm going to try to describe accurately, because accuracy matters more than comfort. It was tall, not bare on its hind legs, taller, 8 feet, maybe more, with proportions that didn't follow any anatomy I knew. The shoulders were enormous, the width of 2 men standing side by side, but the torso tapered sharply, giving it a hunched top-heavy silhouette. The forelimbs were too long, hanging past what should have been its knees, ending in broad dark shapes that could have been paws, except they articulated wrong. They gripped the corner of the building with individual digits. The head sat forward on a thick neck, low and extended, like a bear's, but elongated. The muzzle was too narrow, the jaw was too deep, and from the top of the skull, rising in asymmetric curves, were antlers. Not full racks, jagged forking prongs that looked like they'd been growing unchecked for years, twisting outward and upward in shapes that had nothing to do with season or species. Its eyes caught the spotlight and held it. They were pale, not reflective the way a deer's eyes shine in headlights. They produced their own faint luminance, a sick yellow-amber glow that persisted even after I involuntarily flinched and the beam wavered. It didn't move. It just watched me. I sat in the truck with the shotgun pointed at the windshield and my foot on the gas, and I didn't move either. We stayed like that. It at the corner of the building, me in the cab. It felt like 15 minutes, but was probably closer to 3. Then it shifted its weight. The building's wall cracked where its claws had been gripping. It turned slowly, with a mechanical fluidity that suggested many more joints than it should have had. And then it walked into the dark. The dragging sound started immediately after, but now I knew what it was. It wasn't dragging something. Those forelimbs, those long, terrible arms, were scraping the ground as it walked because they were too long to clear it. I didn't leave my truck again that night. I spent the following day in Harlow, not at the diner, at the county records office, which occupied a single room in the back of the post office. The clerk was a young man who didn't ask questions. He let me access the property files for the Piney Creek parcel without argument. The files told a story that no one had bothered to hide very well, because no one expected anyone to look. The zoo property had been under county management, in one form or another, for 40 years. Before Pruitt's Wildlife Park, it had been a county agricultural station. Before that, a CCC camp during the Depression. Before that, private land owned by a timber family named Kavanaugh, who had logged most of East Texas in the early 1900s. The Kavanaughs had donated the land to the county in 1936 with a single condition written into the deed. The property shall be maintained with living stock or equivalent provision for the local wildlife population at all times, and shall not be left vacant or unattended for any period exceeding 30 days. 30 days? I kept reading. The county had maintained the provision continuously since 1936. The agricultural station had kept cattle and pigs. When the station closed, the county had arranged for Pruitt Zoo to take over. When the zoo failed, the county had begun cycling security contractors through the property on 30-day rotations. There was a file folder at the back of the cabinet labeled Piney Creek Incident Reports. It contained 7 documents spanning the last 6 years. Each one described the early termination of a security contract. 5 of them were one-page summaries, with no detail beyond the dates. One was a 2-page report from a contractor named Weaver, who described large animal activity and structural damage to perimeter fencing before requesting reassignment. The 7th was an insurance claim filed by Allied Protective Services on behalf of a contractor named David Salcedo. He had been hospitalized after being injured by a wild animal during his assignment. Salcedo's incident had occurred on his 20th night. The insurance form listed his injuries as a compound fracture of the left femur, multiple lacerations to his torso, and a punctured lung. The animal was never identified. The claim was paid out. Salcedo's contract was terminated. 2 weeks later, a new contractor started. I photographed every page in the folder. Then I drove back to the park and sat in the lot and looked at the tree line and thought about David Salcedo's punctured lung and the way those claws had gripped the building corner, and the fact that I still had 14 nights left on a contract I couldn't afford to break. That night, 17, I made my perimeter walk armed and alert in a way I hadn't before, at the casual vigilance of a security contractor checking fence lines, the focused, purposeful awareness of someone who knows they're being hunted. I walked the path with the Mossberg in a low, ready position, with my flashlight mounted on the barrel. I moved quietly. I stayed in the open. I kept my back to nothing. I saw it twice, both times from a distance, once near the aviary, once on the far side of the primate enclosure. Both times it was motionless, standing in that hunched, top-heavy posture, watching me with those pale eyes. Both times it let me pass. It was learning my pattern. I was sure of it now. The nightly walks, the routes, the timing. It had been watching me since the beginning. And it had been patient, because patience was what this thing did. It was an ambush predator that had spent years, decades maybe, perfecting its territory. And I was just another animal moving through it on a predictable schedule. The bone arrangements, the vocalizations, the systemic destruction of fencing. None of it was random. It was behavior. Complex, deliberate behavior directed toward a single goal, maintaining control of this place and everything inside it, including me. The next few nights blurred together. I shortened my walks. I reinforced the truck with plywood panels from the old gift shop, screwing them over the windows so that the windshield and the driver's window remained uncovered. I slept during the day in a motel in Harlow and drove out each evening with a cooler of food, a full tank of gas, and the growing certainty that I wasn't going to finish this contract. On night 22, it tested the truck. I was inside, engine running, when something hit the passenger door, enough to buckle the panel inward. Then the rear gate, then the roof. Each impact was singular, precise, and terrifyingly strong. The plywood over the rear window exploded inward in a shower of splinters. I threw the truck into drive and pulled forward 20 feet, and the impact stopped. When I looked in the mirror, there was nothing there. But the roof of the cab had a depression in it, shaped like a handprint. 5 points of contact, each one 3 inches deep. I called Dana at 4 a.m. She didn't answer. I called the Allied Protective Services main line and got a recording. I called the Harlow Sheriff's Dispatch and told the deputy who answered that I had a dangerous animal situation at Piney Creek. Assistance. He told me to stay in the vehicle and that someone would check on me in the morning. In the morning? I repeated. Sir, we don't send anyone out to that property at night. His voice was calm in a way that told me this was not the first time he'd had this conversation. Standard protocol. Stay in your vehicle, keep your lights on, and someone will be there at the first light. I asked him what the protocol was based on. He hung up. Dawn came. Nobody from the sheriff's office showed up. I drove to the motel, showered, packed my bag, and sat on the edge of the bed for an hour staring at the wall. Here's the thing about money. It's not really about the money. It's about what the money represents. The months of rent, the truck payment, the insurance premium, the illusion that your life has structural integrity. I couldn't afford to walk away. That's what they were counting on. That's what they always counted on. With every contractor they'd cycled through this property. Find someone who needs work. Pay them enough to stay. Build in penalties severe enough that leaving feels worse than the alternative. But here's the other thing. The thing I keep coming back to. I'd seen it. I knew what it was. Or at least what it wasn't. It wasn't any animal cataloged by science. It was something that shouldn't exist. And it was something that was going to stay in those 18 acres forever. The fence was failing. The food supply. The deer. The raccoons. Whatever the hell was wandering in from the surrounding woods. It was finite. Darlene's grandmother had talked about places where the animals went quiet. The quiet was spreading. I'd noticed it myself over the past 3 weeks. The coyotes stopped calling. The owls were gone. The forest around Piney Creek was emptying out. And when it was empty, that thing was going to go looking for more. Harlow was 12 miles away. 400 people. I'm not a fucking hero. I want to be clear about that. I'm a 41-year-old man with bad knees and a security license and a deeply average life. And nothing about me was built for this. But I spent 14 years in the Army, and some things stay with you, whether you want them to or not. The understanding that some problems don't have clean solutions. The knowledge that sometimes the only thing standing between a bad situation and a worse one is whoever happens to be there. And I just so happened to be here. I drove to the surplus store in Lufkin. I bought 2 fragmentation grenades from a guy I'd known since my second deployment, who now ran a quiet side business that I'd never had a reason to use before. I bought a plate carrier and steel plates. I bought a hunting knife with a 7-inch blade. I already had my shotgun. I loaded it with rifled slugs, the heaviest I could find. 1-ounce Foster slugs that could drop a bull elk at 50 yards. I drove back to Piney Creek and arrived at 3 in the afternoon. Broad daylight. The park was still and silent in the way I'd come to understand. Not peaceful silence. Vacancy. The silence of a place where every living thing had learned to be somewhere else. I suited up in the parking lot. Plate carrier, knife, shotgun, grenades. I taped the grenades to the outside of the carrier, where I could reach them fast. 1 on each side. Pins oriented for a right-hand pull. I chambered the slug and put 4 more in the tube. The plan was simple, because complicated plans fall apart. Go to the service tunnel, go down the shaft, find where it slept, and kill it. I knew the plan had a significant chance of killing me instead. I had made peace with that possibility somewhere on the drive back from Lufkin. It had settled over me with a calmness that surprised me. Not bravery, not resignation, that comes when you eliminated every option except one. I walked through the park in the afternoon light. The murals on the visitor center wall grinned their melting grins. The paths were cracked and overgrown. I passed the aviary, the reptile house, the primate enclosures. I passed the bear enclosure and looked down at the bone structure below. It had grown again. The arches reached higher now, nearly touching at their apex. I turned away and kept walking. The service tunnel door was still held by the cable I'd strung across it. I cut it, pulled the door open, and went in. The smell was immediate. That dense, living rot, stronger than before. I breathed through my mouth and moved forward. Flashlight on the barrel, shotgun up, step by careful step down the concrete corridor. The scrape marks on the ceiling were deeper, fresher. Dark flakes of concrete littered on the floor like dead skin. I reached the junction, left to the bone room, right to the deeper tunnels. I went left first to confirm the room was empty. It wasn't. The bone murals had expanded. They covered every surface now. Walls, ceilings, floor. The resinous substance holding them in place was fresher here, still tacky, and it pulsed with a faint warmth that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. The drain shaft in the center of the floor was wider. Something had been enlarging it, carving the edges back night by night, and the darkness below was absolute. I dropped a glow stick into the shaft. It fell for 3 seconds before hitting the bottom and casting a green circle of light across a rough stone floor 25 feet below. The floor was covered in bones, hundreds of them, a carpet of remains stretching to the edges of the glow stick's reach and beyond. And in the far corner, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It unfolded from the dark the way a spider uncurls from a crack. First the arms, those long, terrible arms bracing against the walls. Then the shoulders, the hunched mass of them blocking out green light as the body rose. The antlers scraped the ceiling of the chamber below, sending down a rain of stone dust. The eyes opened last, and they found me immediately. I fired. The first slug hit its center mass. The sound in the enclosed space was catastrophic, a concussive blast that turned the air white and left my ears ringing. The thing jerked backward, hit the far wall, and made a sound that I'll hear for whatever remains of my life. Not a roar, a scream, high, keening, almost human in its register, but backed by a volume and resonance that vibrated in my chest cavity. I racked the slide and fired again. The second slug hit its shoulder. The third hit somewhere lower. It was moving now, climbing the walls of the shaft with a speed that was incompatible with its size, hauling itself upward with those clawed hands while its legs churned against the stone below. I could see it in the muzzle flash. The matted dark fur, the wrong proportions, the way the muscles moved beneath the skin in patterns that suggested more autonomy than any single animal should contain. The fourth slug missed. The fifth hit it in the neck as it reached the lip of the shaft. It screamed again, and one arm came over the edge. And then it was there, pulling itself up into the room with me, filling the space with its bulk and its smell and the yellow glow of its eyes. And I understood two things simultaneously. The shotgun wasn't going to kill it, and I wasn't going to make it out of this tunnel. And there's a moment after the pin is out and the spoon is flipped where you have about 4 seconds. In training, 4 seconds feels like nothing. In that tunnel, with that thing rising in front of me, 4 seconds felt like a long time. Long enough to notice the way the bone murals on the walls seemed to lean inward. Long enough to see my flashlight beam refract through the creature's breath, which hung in the air like fog. Long enough to think about the motel room in Harlow, where my bag was still sitting on the bed, packed and ready for a trip I wasn't going to take. I stepped forward. I pressed my hand against its chest. The fur was coarse and hot, and beneath it, I could feel the rapid, arrhythmic hammering of a heart that didn't beat like anything from this world. Those muscles contracted under my palm. The eyes were inches from mine. The grenade went off. This document was recovered from a weatherproof case in the cab of a 2019 Ford F-250, registered to Marcus Hale, found in the parking area of the former Piney Creek Wildlife Park on November 19th during a routine county property inspection. The vehicle showed significant structural damage to the roof, passenger door, and rear gate. The Mossberg 500 shotgun was found in the service tunnel with the magazine empty. Evidence of a detonation event was identified in a subsurface maintenance chamber, though the extent of structural collapse prevented full assessment. No human remains were recovered. No animal remains were recovered. The county has scheduled the next security rotation for December 1st. The contract is for 30 nights.